40 Mile River, Yukon Territory, November 18, 1996. While prospectors race to build log cabins before the killing cold arrives, one man pitches what looks like a circus tent. His neighbors call him insane. By February, when temperatures plunge to 58 below zero, that tent will register an internal temperature 45 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the sturdiest log structures around it, burning half the firewood and requiring no chinked gaps, no moss stuffing, no desperate middle-of-night stoking. What did this solitary prospector understand about heat retention that an entire camp of experienced frontiersmen had missed? Before we reveal the answer, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us, have you ever seen traditional wisdom outperform modern assumptions? Now let's go back to that frozen November day when mockery was about to meet mathematics. 40 Mile River, Yukon Territory, November 3, 1896. The temperature hovers at 22 degrees Fahrenheit as the last paddle wheeler of the season churns south, abandoning 340 prospectors to 7 months of darkness and cold that will routinely touch 50 below zero. Along the riverbank, the sound of axes rings constant, men racing to notch logs, stack walls, seal cracks with moss and mud before the ground freezes solid. Then Magnus Sorensen arrives at Claim 47, with no axe, no saw, no team of horses to drag timber. He carries only canvas, rope, and 3 heavy burlap sacks that clank with an odd metallic sound. The reaction is immediate. "That Norski's gonna die in a tent," laughs Tom Bradley, a Michigan logger who's already raised the walls of a 16 by 20-foot cabin. Probably thinks he's back in some summer camp. Others are less amused. When Sorensen begins driving stakes in a circular pattern, not the rectangular footprint every sensible man knows, old Samuel Grant, who survived 3 Alaskan winters, shakes his head slowly. "I've seen greenhorns freeze. This one won't last past Christmas." Even the camp's unofficial engineer, a man named Dalton, who'd built mine supports in Colorado, dismisses the scene outright. Canvas has no thermal mass, it's suicide. But Magnus Sorensen doesn't argue. He simply works. First, he excavates, not the shallow scraping most men do, but a full 18 inches down into the earth, creating a floor below ground level. The dirt goes into careful piles, sorted by size. Then he begins assembling something that looks nothing like a tent. The canvas forms only the outermost layer of what will become a 4-layer system. Beneath it, he's stretching wool blankets he's sewn into panels. Beneath those, a layer of caribou hide, fur side inward. And strangest of all, he's building a low stone wall inside this structure, a circular ring 2 feet high, made from river rocks he's been collecting for days. "He's building a fort inside a tent," someone mutters. The man's lost his mind. By November 15th, as the first serious cold arrives and most cabins are barely weather-tight, Sorensen's structure stands complete. It's 14 feet in diameter, with walls that slope inward to a central smoke hole. The 4-layer walls create air gaps, something the watching prospectors can't see, but will soon matter enormously. Inside that stone ring, he's placed what those burlap sacks contained. 200 pounds of flat river stones, each roughly the size of a dinner plate, arranged in careful stacks. His fire won't sit in an open hearth. It will burn inside this thermal battery, and those stones will decide who was the fool and who was the engineer. The betting begins that night in Bradley's half-finished cabin. 2 weeks, someone wagers. He'll be begging for a bunk in someone's place by Thanksgiving. Another man, more generous, gives him until Christmas. Not one person in that camp of 340 souls believes Magnus Sorensen will see spring in that canvas joke. They're about to learn that dismissing centuries of Sami reindeer herding wisdom as primitive was the real mistake. What the prospectors saw, canvas stretched over poles, revealed nothing of what Sorensen had engineered. The design came from northern Scandinavia, refined over centuries by the Sami people who followed reindeer herds across landscapes where winter temperatures routinely dropped below -40. But Sorensen hadn't simply copied a traditional lavu, he had adapted it, combining Sami principles with techniques he had observed among Mongolian herders during 2 years prospecting in Siberia. The result was a hybrid structure that modern thermodynamics would later validate as near optimal for extreme cold. The foundation told the first part of the story. By excavating 18 inches down, Sorensen had placed his living space below the frost line,
where Earth temperature stabilizes around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface air reaches deadly cold.
The excavated dirt formed a berm around the structure's perimeter, an earth rampart 14 inches high that blocked wind at ground level, where a convective heat loss is most severe. This wasn't decorative. Earth has thermal conductivity of roughly 0.5 watts per meter K, compared to wood's 0.12 watts per meter K. But in this application, that mattered less than its mass and wind-blocking properties. The four-layer wall system created three separate air gaps, each approximately 1.5 inches wide. The outer canvas layer broke wind and shed precipitation. Beneath it, the air gap between canvas and wool provided a dead air insulation zone, and dead air, with a thermal conductivity near 0.024 watts per meter K, is one of nature's best insulators. The wool blanket layer added both mass and moisture control. Wool retains insulating properties even when damp, unlike cotton canvas. Another air gap separated wool from caribou hide, and that innermost fur layer, fur side facing inward, created microscopic air pockets while providing a radiant barrier. The entire wall assembly was roughly 7 inches thick and weighed approximately 180 pounds, creating thermal mass that would stabilize internal temperatures. But the true genius sat in the center, that circular stone ring and its 200 pounds of river rocks. Sorensen had selected flat sandstone and granite pieces specifically for their thermal mass properties. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity around 0.92 kilojoules per kilogram K, and granite near 0.79 kilojoules per kilogram K, meaning they absorb and release significant heat energy slowly. His fire would burn inside this ring for 3 to 4 hours each evening, heating the stones to approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 204 degrees Celsius. Then he'd bank the coals, cover the ring with a flat stone lid he'd shaped, and let thermal radiation do its work. The mathematics were elegant. At 200 pounds, roughly 90 kilograms, his stone mass could store approximately 18,000 BTUs when heated from 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Released slowly overnight through radiation and conduction, this heat would maintain livable temperatures for 10 to 12 hours with zero additional fuel, a feat impossible in a log cabin where heat escapes through gaps, chinks, and the chimney draft that must stay open. The conical shape mattered too. Hot air naturally rises to the peak where Sorensen had installed an adjustable smoke flap. By controlling this opening, he could regulate draft and heat retention with precision no rectangular cabin could match. When Tom Bradley walked past on November 18th and saw smoke rising from that tent, he laughed again. "Burning his furniture already," he called to others. "Give him 3 more days." What Bradley couldn't see was internal temperature holding steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, with no active fire, while his own cabin, with flames roaring in a stone fireplace, struggled to reach 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, and required constant feeding of logs that vanished up the chimney. The experienced builder was hemorrhaging heat. The fool was storing it. Winter was about to reveal which approach was actually stupid. January 11th, 1897. The temperature at 40 Mile River reaches minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 50 degrees Celsius, under a clear, windless sky, the kind of cold that makes breath crystallize instantly and bare skin freeze in under 2 minutes. It's the 14th consecutive day below minus 40, and the camp is suffering. In Tom Bradley's cabin, despite a fire that consumes 40 pounds of wood every 6 hours, the temperature inside hovers around 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 8 degrees Celsius. Water buckets freeze solid overnight. Men sleep in every lair they own, pressed close to the hearth, and still wake with frost in their beards. 2 prospectors in poorly chinked cabins have already lost toes to frostbite. The community is burning through wood at an unsustainable rate, and spring is still 3 months away. Magnus Sorensen's shelter tells a different story. When Samuel Grant, humbled by desperation and curiosity, asks permission to enter on the morning of January 12th, he finds internal conditions that seem physically impossible. A thermometer hanging from the central pole reads 63 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius, a full 45 degrees warmer than Bradley's cabin, and an astonishing 121 degrees above outside air temperature. Sorensen sits in shirt sleeves, eating a hot meal. The stone ring radiates gentle warmth, its rocks still holding heat from the previous evening's fire, which burned out 6 hours earlier. There's no active flame, no desperate stoking, no frantic gathering of frozen logs in darkness. Grant stares at the thermometer, then at Sorensen, and back to the instrument. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Sorensen gestures to a small pile near the entrance. "About 12 pounds. I fire it for 3 hours after sunset, let the stones soak the heat, and bank it." Grant does the math in his head. Bradley's cabin is consuming roughly 160 pounds of wood per day. Sorensen is using perhaps 35 to 40 pounds, less than 1/4 the fuel, and achieving temperatures 45 degrees higher. "That's not possible," Grant says. Sorensen smiles.
Tell that to the Sami. They've known for 1,000 years. Word spreads through the camp with remarkable speed. By January 13th, a dozen men have visited the shelter, each leaving with the same expression of disbelief. They run their hands along the 4-layer walls, feeling warmth that seems to radiate from within the structure itself. They examine the stone ring, noting how the flat rocks are arranged in stacks with air channels between them, creating convection currents that distribute heat evenly. They observe the adjustable smoke flap at the peak, which Sorensen manipulates to control draft and heat escape. And they calculate, in a winter that might last until late April, Sorensen will burn roughly 5,000 pounds of wood total. Bradley's cabin will consume at least 19,000 pounds. That's a difference of 14,000 pounds, roughly 7 cords of wood that must be cut, hauled, split, and dried. On January 14th, Tom Bradley himself appears at Sorensen's entrance, pride visibly wrestled into submission by practical need. "I'd like to understand how this works," he says quietly. Sorensen invites him in, offers him tea heated on the stone ring, and begins to explain. He talks about thermal mass, how stone absorbs heat energy and releases it slowly, unlike air which heats quickly and escapes through any gap. He explains the air layers in the walls, how dead air insulates better than solid wood. He describes the earth berm and below-grade floor, noting that ground temperature stays relatively stable even in extreme cold. Bradley listens, occasionally touching the warm stones, feeling the radiant heat that requires no visible flame. Before we continue, hit that like button, subscribe for more frontier engineering wisdom, and comment below, what's the coldest temperature you've ever had to survive? Now, let's examine exactly why this primitive design outperformed every log cabin in camp. The performance gap wasn't magic, it was physics, applied through centuries of trial, error, and observation by cultures that couldn't afford mistakes in environments where winter meant potential death. To understand why Sorensen's shelter achieved what seemed impossible, we need to examine 3 critical principles: thermal mass, insulation through layering, and the geometry of heat retention. Thermal mass came first. A log cabin's walls, typically 6 to 8 inches of solid wood, have mass, but they also conduct heat outward. Wood's thermal conductivity, 0.12 watts per meter Kelvin, is relatively low, but in extreme cold with a temperature differential of 120 degrees F between inside and outside, heat migrates steadily through the logs. More critically, log cabins leak. Even the best chinked structure has gaps where logs settle, where corners meet imperfectly, where doorframes fit loosely. These gaps create convective heat loss. Warm air escapes, cold air infiltrates,
which no amount of thermal mass can overcome. A log cabin is essentially a leaky box heated by a fireplace that exhausts 70 to 80% of its heat energy up the chimney. You're not heating the structure, you're fighting continuous heat loss with continuous fire. Sorensen's stone ring inverted this equation. Those 200 pounds of river rocks, heated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit over 3 to 4 hours, stored approximately 18,000 BTUs, enough energy to maintain a 45-degree temperature differential for 10 to 12 hours through pure thermal radiation. The rocks sat inside the shelter's envelope, so all heat radiated inward, not up a chimney. The specific heat capacity of stone meant it released energy slowly and steadily, creating gentle, sustained warmth rather than the violent temperature swings of an open fire. This wasn't a hearth you fed constantly. It was a thermal battery you charged once per day.
The four-layer wall system provided what modern engineers call a super-insulated envelope. Each air gap between layers created resistance to heat transfer. The outer canvas broke wind. The first air gap, 1.5 inches, provided insulation value roughly equivalent to 3 inches of wood. The wool blanket layer added moisture management and additional mass. The second air gap doubled the insulation effect. The inner caribou hide layer, with fur facing inward, created thousands of microscopic air pockets, each one a tiny insulation cell, while also providing a radiant barrier that reflected heat back into the living space. The total R value of this wall system was approximately R12 to R14, compared to R6 to R8 for a typical 6-inch log wall. That's double the insulation value. But geometry mattered as much as materials. The circular floor plan minimized perimeter relative to floor area. Basic mathematics shows a circle encloses maximum area with minimum perimeter, reducing heat loss surface. The conical shape naturally stratified air. Hot air rose to the peak, where Sorensen could control its escape via the smoke flap, while cooler air settled to the floor, where the earth berm and below-grade excavation provided thermal stability.
This wasn't random. It was the same principle that makes a TP efficient, refined through thousands of years of indigenous engineering on the North American plains and Sami experience in Scandinavia. The final element was draft control. A log cabin fireplace requires continuous airflow. Fresh air enters through gaps, feeds combustion, and exits up the chimney, carrying most heat energy with it. You can't stop this without extinguishing your fire, so you're locked in a cycle of continuous burning. Sorensen's system separated combustion from heating. He burned his fire hot and fast while the smoke hole was open, maximizing stone heating. Then he closed the flap to about 2 inches, extinguished active flames, and let thermal mass do the work. No draft meant no convective heat loss. The shelter became a sealed thermal envelope, slowly releasing stored energy. By January 20th, 11 prospectors had begun excavating circular foundations. By February 1st, 4 hybrid shelters stood complete, each adapting Sorensen's principles to available materials. Tom Bradley, the man who'd called him a fool, was spending 3 hours each evening in Sorensen's shelter, sketching details, asking questions, measuring temperatures and fuel consumption. The data was undeniable. Thermal mass heating with superior insulation was consuming 73% less fuel while maintaining temperatures 35 to 45 degrees higher. The primitive tent was humiliating the frontier orthodoxy of log cabin construction. Spring would arrive with an entire camp converted, not through argument, but through mathematics applied to survival. By late February 1897, the transformation of 40 Mile River Camp was undeniable.
What had begun as one man's circus tent had spawned 17 hybrid shelters within a 50-mile radius, each adapting Magna Sorensen's principles to available materials and individual needs. The conversion wasn't driven by fashion or trend. It was driven by brutal economics and the simple desire to survive without exhausting oneself cutting cordwood in -40-degree darkness. Tom Bradley's shelter, completed February 18th, represented the most sophisticated adaptation. He'd kept his log cabin walls but gutted the interior fireplace entirely, replacing it with a central stone ring modeled directly on Sorensen's design. He'd collected 240 pounds of granite and sandstone from a rocky outcrop 2 miles upriver, selecting flat pieces that could stack efficiently. Inside his existing structure, he built an interior wall using caribou hides he'd traded for with indigenous hunters, creating a 2-inch air gap between hide and logs. The result? His internal temperature rose from an average of 22 degrees, -6 degrees Celsius, to 51 degrees, 11 degrees Celsius, while his wood consumption dropped from 160 pounds daily to 58 pounds. He was burning 64% less fuel and sleeping without frostbite risk for the first time in 3 months. Samuel Grant took a different approach. At 67 years old, he lacked the strength to excavate and haul stone, so he adapted the principle rather than copying the structure. He lined his existing cabin's interior walls with layered wool blankets, creating air gaps by hanging them on wooden frames spaced 2 inches from the logs. He built a smaller thermal mass system using only 80 pounds of river stones arranged in a shallow fire pit. His results were less dramatic than Bradley's, but still significant. Temperature increase of 18 degrees, fuel consumption down by 35%. "I'm not an engineer," he told visitors, "but I understand now that air stands still is warmer than air blowing through. Should have learned that 50 years ago." The indigenous Han people who maintained seasonal camps near 40 Mile watched this discovery with quiet amusement. They'd been using similar principles for generations: semi-subterranean structures with earth berms, central fire pits surrounded by stone, and layered skin walls, adapted to the specific needs of salmon fishing camps and winter hunting grounds. When a prospector named William Hayes asked a Han elder named Peter about the technique, Peter smiled and gestured to a nearby traditional structure. "You think the tent man invented warm houses?" he asked. "Our grandmothers would laugh. We taught him to dig down. We showed him which stones hold heat longest. He listened. Most of you don't." By March 15th, the camp's collective firewood consumption had dropped by an estimated 42%, a staggering savings that meant the difference between exhausting the nearby timber supply and maintaining sustainable harvest. Men who'd been spending 6 to 8 hours daily cutting and hauling wood were now spending 3 to 4 hours, freeing time for actual prospecting, equipment repair, and rest. The health impacts were measurable. Respiratory infections from constant smoke inhalation decreased as men switched from continuous open fires to shorter, hotter burns in controlled stone systems. Frostbite cases dropped to near zero.
2 men who'd been planning to abandon their claims and retreat south changed their minds, convinced they could now survive comfortably until spring breakup. The spread of the technique followed social networks. Every man who visited Sorensen's shelter became an evangelist, returning to his own cabin with measurements, sketches, and testimonials. Some adaptations failed. One prospector tried using shale, which fractured under heat cycling and had to be replaced with granite. Another man built his stone ring too large, requiring excessive fuel to heat the mass. But the failures taught as much as the successes, and by early April, a collective body of knowledge had formed.
Optimal stone mass for a 12 to 14-foot shelter, 180 to 220 pounds. Ideal air gap width, 1.5 to 2 inches. Best burning schedule, 3 to 4 hours of hot fire starting 2 hours before sunset. The camp had effectively conducted a distributed engineering experiment, and the results were being documented in journals and letters sent south on the first paddle wheelers of spring. When Magnus Sorensen finally left 40 Mile in May 1897, bound for the Klondike where richer strikes beckoned, he left behind more than 17 adapted shelters. He'd left a permanent shift in how frontier builders understood heat, insulation, and survival. Tom Bradley would go on to build similar structures in Dawson City, where they'd be called Bradley stoves despite their origin. Samuel Grant wrote a detailed letter to his nephew in Montana describing the principles, spawning similar experiments in mountain mining camps across the West. The tent that was a joke had become the standard by which all cold weather shelters would be measured, not through marketing or mandate, but through the simple, undeniable mathematics of staying warm while burning less fuel. The story of Magnus Sorensen's shelter is often told as one man's genius, but that telling misses the deeper truth. Sorensen didn't invent thermal mass heating, layered insulation, or conical geometry optimized for heat retention. He learned these principles from the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, who'd refined them across 1,000 years of reindeer herding in climates where winter temperatures routinely dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. They, in turn, had learned from even older traditions, generations of Arctic and subarctic peoples who understood that survival in extreme cold required working with physics, not against it. What Sorensen did, and what makes his story worth telling, was recognize that indigenous and traditional knowledge wasn't primitive superstition to be dismissed, but engineering to be studied. When Han hunters showed him how excavating below grade provided thermal stability, he didn't assume his modern cabin knowledge was superior. When he observed Mongolian herders using felt layers with air gaps during his time in Siberia, he didn't write it off as backward technology. He tested, measured, adapted, and applied. His shelter was a synthesis: Sami Lavu geometry, Mongolian layering techniques, North American stone selection, all filtered through careful observation of what actually worked in life-or-death conditions. The prospectors who mocked him weren't stupid. They were trapped in the assumption that frontier wisdom came from their own cultural tradition: the log cabin, the stone fireplace, the open hearth that their grandfathers had used in Kentucky or Michigan or Pennsylvania. These were proven designs, successful structures that had sheltered millions, but proven in Pennsylvania doesn't mean optimal in the Yukon. When you transplant a technology across climatic zones without adaptation, you often get a system that barely functions. Those log cabins kept men alive, but at enormous cost in labor, fuel, and comfort. They represented cultural continuity, not engineering optimization. The temperature differential, 45 degrees warmer while burning 73% less fuel, wasn't a minor improvement. It was the difference between endurance and comfort, between survival and thriving, between exhausting the local timber supply in 3 years or maintaining sustainable harvest indefinitely. Modern building science would later validate every principle Sorensen applied: thermal mass for heat storage, dead air gaps for insulation, reduced surface area to volume ratios for heat retention, earth berming for thermal stability. But the Sami, the Han, the Mongolian herders, they'd known these truths not through laboratory testing, but through the laboratory of lived experience across centuries.
By 1900, variants of the thermal mass shelter appeared throughout Alaska and the Yukon. Some retained the circular geometry. Others adapted the stone heating system into rectangular cabins.
The principle proved remarkably scalable. Mining operations built communal versions, using 800 to 1,000 pounds of stone, heating structures that housed 20 men, while burning less fuel than 4 traditional cannons.
Remote trading posts adopted the design, cutting their heating costs dramatically. Even some military installations in Alaska experimented with hybrid systems. The idea had proven itself too valuable to remain confined to one camp on the 40-mile river. What happened to Magnus Sorensen? Historical records show he worked claims around Dawson City through 1899, then disappeared from official documentation, a common fate for prospectors who either struck it rich and retired quietly or died anonymously in the wilderness. But his shelter survived him. Photographs from 1902 show structures clearly influenced by his design still standing at 40 Mile, still being used by prospectors and trappers. Oral histories collected in the 1950s reference the Norwegians' warm tent as a turning point in Yukon building practices. The knowledge persisted because it worked, and because men like Tom Bradley and Samuel Grant passed it on, not as tradition, but as tested engineering. The lesson extends beyond frontier shelters. Throughout human history, we've repeatedly dismissed traditional knowledge as primitive, only to rediscover, often centuries later, that it represented sophisticated solutions to complex problems. Indigenous fire management practices that prevented catastrophic wildfires, dismissed as savage and banned, are now being reintegrated into modern forestry. Traditional fermentation techniques, once called unsanitary, are now understood as sophisticated preservation biotechnology. Vernacular architecture optimized for local climates is being studied by modern engineers seeking energy-efficient design. The pattern repeats: arrogance first, humility later, often after significant cost. Magnus Sorensen's shelter stands as a reminder that innovation often means recognizing wisdom that already exists in other cultures, in older traditions, in practices refined through generations of observation and need. The prospectors who laughed weren't fools. They simply hadn't learned yet that the strongest engineering often looks, at first glance, like the simplest solution. A tent that stays 45 degrees warmer while burning a quarter of the fuel isn't magic. It's mathematics, material science, and centuries of accumulated knowledge, applied by a man humble enough to learn from peoples his society had taught him to dismiss. If you found this story valuable, hit that like button one final time, subscribe for more forgotten frontier engineering, and comment below. What piece of traditional knowledge have you seen outperform modern assumptions? The past has more to teach us than we usually admit, but only if we're willing to listen, measure, and learn. Until next time, stay warm, and remember, sometimes the real fools are the ones who laugh first and calculate later.